Joining us now on the line from New York, New York, is James Traub. He is contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and a columnist at foreignpolicy.com. And James, it's good to have you on the program again. How are you tonight?
Fine. Happy to be here.
Glad you are. Let's just, before we get our first question to you, go through a bit of background here because, quite frankly, Côte d'Ivoire is not on everybody's front burner all the time. So I'll ask our director, Michael Smith, to start by bringing a map up. Here's Côte d'Ivoire, the former French colony located in Western Africa, bordering the North Atlantic Ocean between Ghana and Liberia. In terms of size, it's a little larger than the American state New Mexico. The capital is that city in the middle, Yamoussoukro. The largest city is Abidjan in the south. Population 21 million, and this country produces 40% of the world's cocoa crop, a major exporter of bananas, coffee, cotton, palm oil, pineapples, rubber, tropical wood products, and tuna, and was apparently remarkably stable from its independence from France in 1960 until the coup in late 1999, followed by civil war, and the place has been quite a mess since then. James, just before the first question, here's something that you wrote in Foreign Policy back a week ago. A stare down in a remote and not very consequential corner of the world has become a test of that noble but vague entity known as the international community. The confrontation pits Laurent Gbagbo, the strongman leader of the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, who has refused to step down despite losing an election last November against the United States, France, and an array of international organizations. The United Nations, the World Bank, the African Union, and the West African regional body known as ECOWAS. It sounds like an extremely unequal confrontation, but 6 weeks after the election, Gbagbo still occupies the presidential palace and shows no intention of leaving. So let's start there, James. Why isn't he going?
Well, because he thinks he doesn't have to and because he doesn't want to. It's not as if we haven't seen this movie before. This is, after all, what Robert Mugabe has done in Zimbabwe. And look, Mugabe is still there. Part of a power-sharing government, effectively controls the country. Gbagbo, who I have been in the same room with but never met, so what I say about him is from talking to other people, is not only an extremely wily and extremely ruthless politician, he has a sense of his own destiny as the authentic leader of Côte d'Ivoire, and he just takes it for granted that he is the man who is supposed to lead that country. The fact that he lost an election to him is simply a minor detail. He's not going to let that stand in his way.
So with all of these international forces arrayed against him, how is it actually that he's able to hang on to power?
Well, again, it's like, any number of African dictators, in effect, have dared the world, come and get me if you're willing to, and they almost never are. And so as long as you still have your security forces around you, you can resist almost anything short of some kind of military operation. And he knows that even though this organization you mentioned, ECOWAS, which is a West African regional body, has threatened to use military force if Gbagbo refuses to step down, I think he probably recognizes they don't want to send their armies up against his. So at this point, it's a kind of waiting game. As long as Gbagbo can still earn enough revenue to pay off his security forces and to pay off at least an essential core of civil servants to keep the most basic government services running, he can stay there. And so he is there occupying the throne of government. In a squalid hotel across Abidjan is Alassane Ouattara, who won the election, but is powerless to unseat Gbagbo. And so far, all attempts at pressure by the international community to get Gbagbo to go peacefully have failed.
You know, from time to time, these guys either leave or are forced to leave, and we saw just very recently the popular uprising in Tunisia overthrow an authoritarian president. Why do you suppose that hasn't happened in Côte d'Ivoire yet?
Well, here's a crucial difference between Ben Ali of Tunisia and Gbagbo of the Ivory Coast. Gbagbo is a politician. He was elected. He is seen as the tribune of a very large fraction of that country, essentially its southern half. He won 44% of the vote. So let's say 40-some-odd% of people in Côte d'Ivoire view him as the legitimate leader of the country. Ben Ali was an authoritarian ruler who had no political base of his own. His base came from having satisfied people's economic aspirations. The moment he stopped doing that, because he had no democratic support whatsoever and no real ethnic or national support, He had no support. And so what happened in the case of Ben Ali was that once the people went to the streets, everybody opposed him. It was this one man against everybody else. That's not true at all in the Ivory Coast. The Ivory Coast is genuinely divided right now.
Now, the international community is well known for making a lot of noise, but not in fact being able to do anything in situations like this. But what have they tried to do to get Gbagbo to step down?
Well, they've done the right things. I mean, they have clamped whatever sanctions on him, on the government generally, and on him and other individuals specifically, that they can. And so the World Bank has basically called in its loans. The United States, the EU, and other individual Western countries have put sanctions on these folks. So in theory, Gbagbo ought not be able to earn enough money to be able to pay folks. But he has the advantage. You reeled off that long list of exports, the most important of which are first cocoa, and then one I think maybe you didn't mention, which is oil. And so oil is a national enterprise, as it is in many African countries, and so that revenue goes directly to the state. Then in the case of cocoa, these are private companies, but they pay significant customs duties. And so what Gbagbo has done, there was an article about this in today's New York Times, is he basically has threatened these guys physically. That they have to pay him up front, taxes they might be paying later. Banks have to keep servicing his accounts and funneling cash to the government. I threat of physical harm, of death. I mean, basically he's saying, pay me or I'll kill you. And so far, he seems to be able to get up the scratch. There's some disagreement. Does he need $50 million a month? Does he need $100 million a month? Presumably that depends on how broad a set of services he wants to keep going. So far, he's been able to do that. Now, that may not last. Those guys may finally say, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to pay you. I'm willing to take that risk. The moment that happens, if he can't pay his security forces, he's cooked. Then he has no choice. He's going to have to step down.
Let me read another excerpt from your piece in Foreign Policy. This is the hour of Europe, Luxembourg's foreign minister said as violence flared in the Balkans in 1991. Europe failed. A decade later, the atrocities in Darfur, Sudan, challenged the commitment to never again stand by in the face of genocide, as countries had in Rwanda. This time, the whole world failed. And the failure came to be understood paradigmatically. The international community is not prepared to use force to stop atrocities carried out as a conscious instrument of state policy. I guess, is the lesson for Gbagbo that when push comes to shove, the international community, in fact, will not respond militarily to do anything about him?
That's what he thinks. And, you know, there are interesting counterexamples to that. That ECOWAS actually has been quite active in that regard. And both in the case of Sierra Leone and in the case of Liberia, they sent troops, almost entirely Nigerian, into those countries in the face of chaos and atrocities. So it's not unimaginable that they would do that. Now, Cote d'Ivoire, though, in Cote d'Ivoire, you're not facing a bunch of ragtag, drug-crazed gangsters. You're facing an army. Now, Cote d'Ivoire's army is not particularly large or effective by African standards, but it's an army. And so you could have a tremendously bloody combat. And I'm really skeptical that the principal governments of ECOWAS, and again, in effect, we're really talking about Nigeria, which very much calls the shots there, I cannot believe that they are prepared to send significant numbers of soldiers, perhaps to their death, in order to unseat this one guy. This is, after all, it is not as if he's committing atrocities. He has probably committed some terrible crimes. Somewhere on the order of 200 people have been killed by his security forces, formal and informal, since the beginning of this political tension. But it's not like a fellow like Charles Taylor in Liberia, or a case like Darfur, for example.
And having said that, how would citizens in Cote d'Ivoire themselves react to foreign troops coming onto their soil to effect a change in government?
Hugely divided. The Northerners who support Alassane Ouattara would be delighted, and they've been begging some kind of international force to come in. The Southerners, though, would almost certainly see this as a violation of their national sovereignty. Now, if such a thing is going to happen, it is far better that it be an African force than that it be an international force that is significantly Western. And I think this has been the key to a lot of these crises in Africa. How does the neighborhood react? And so, for example, a couple of years back when you had a disputed election in Kenya, you had an immediate rallying of African diplomats who were able to go there and at least diffuse the tensions far enough that a terrible spasm of violence didn't turn into genuine atrocities. On the other hand, in the case of Darfur or in the case of Zimbabwe, in the end, the neighbors were unwilling to really react, and so nothing happened.
You concluded your piece by saying that this crisis in Côte d'Ivoire is, quote unquote, Africa's hour. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was harking back to that quote I used before about the hour of Europe, which turned out to be just hot air. But now, when you say this cannot stand and we will do whatever needs to be done to ensure that it cannot stand, well, you've really thrown down the gauntlet. And so you have to show that you have the kind of political will and institutional muscle to prevent a violation of the most basic standards. That is, Africa is seeking to increasingly enshrine democratic standards. And it has these institutions like the African Union and ECOWAS and others that are at least officially dedicated to advancing democratic principles. This guy is behaving with complete contempt for those principles. And so these organizations have said, we won't let this happen. Well, so what happens if Gbagbo wins? That's a way of saying that all these institutions and all these claims, it's just a paper tiger.
So what, short of military intervention, can they do that they haven't done yet?
I think one thing has to be clear, that there won't be any compromise permitted. I'm sure what Gbagbo would like is what Mugabe succeeded in getting, which is a so-called unity government, where you basically force an unwilling political opponent into the clutches of one of these ruthless characters. And the next thing you know, the unity government is a sham, and the guy has now reinforced his own rule. The world has to make it absolutely clear to Gbagbo that that is not going to happen. And so there's no value for him in waiting out Ouattara, because he's not ultimately going to get that. So I think besides that, the best you can do now is in every way possible cut off his sources of financing. That's the key thing. If he can't make this $50 to $100 million a month, he's going to have no choice but to step down.
I'm not sure I mean this facetiously. I think I mean this seriously, although this is a kind of a radical suggestion here. But understandably, if the neighbors don't want to send their troops in to remove this guy because they're afraid that their troops are going to be killed in the hundreds, if not in the thousands, has anybody thought about sending hit teams in and just taking this guy out?
Well, you know, the answer is no. But beyond that, again, remember, it's not just a guy. I mean, this guy has now taken, he's deeply divided this country. And there's the real danger of, there has been for quite a while, a danger of civil war in Côte d'Ivoire. And so I think if you have, I don't know, some kind of G.I. Joe international hit team going in there and take, even if they succeeded, I think that would cause a tremendous uproar. Wouldn't it all be like getting Ben Ali out of Tunisia? So it has to be some kind of negotiated settlement in which Gbagbo is ultimately seen as stepping down voluntarily, even if under enormous pressure. But, you know, ultimately, is he going to force a situation where the only choice is going to be some kind of military action? It's possible he will. I think that would be a good thing if that were the choice, but I think it's unlikely to happen.
In our last minute, James, given what you've learned about the place and your reporting, how much backbone do you see in Africa's leaders to do what you feel needs to be done in order that justice prevail here?
You know, right now they're all talking a good game. And Côte d'Ivoire is not such a strategically important country. They can afford to alienate it. But it's also a matter of time. What if Gbagbo is able to just basically sit there? Ultimately, will those institutions and those leaders have enough patience to wait him out? I don't think so. I think Gbagbo may calculate that if he can last long enough, then they'll cave.
As always, James, we appreciate your visits to our program. James Traub, contributing writer, New York Times Magazine, and at foreignpolicy.com. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you.